So, hi everyone. Thank you for attending this conference. This talk is titled Writing Free Culture Fantasy with Free Software and will be presented by Seth Patterson. Seth Patterson is a writer of free culture fiction using tools like Nano and Markdown. And this talk will be about writing fiction using free software tools and creating a storytelling community. Seth Patterson, it's up to you. If you have any question, do not hesitate to ask in the chat. We will try to collect the interesting ones. Thanks. Have a nice talk.
Okay. Like he said, I'm Seth Patterson. I have a BS in cybersecurity from Northern Kentucky University, and learning how bad guys think helped me learn how to write bad guys in my stories. I write mainly science fiction and fantasy and release it all under free culture or freely distributable licenses. So, first, I'm going to define what free culture is. Freedom defined says free cultural works are works or expressions which can be freely studied, applied, copied, and or modified by anyone for any purpose. You'll notice that definition sounds a lot like the four freedoms of free software. Free culture is like free software, only it applies to a broader array of things like drawings or stories or movies. Common licenses that are used for it are Creative Commons Zero or Creative Commons Attribution Share Alike. That's the license I normally use, or the GNU Free Documentation License. There's a similar concept called freely redistributable works. They're works that can be shared without permission, but they can lack other freedoms, like you might not be allowed to make any derivative works, or you might not be allowed to charge money for selling copies. That's what makes them non-free, but they're still better than fully proprietary works. I write free culture fiction. I use free software to do it, and I think about my prose like it's code. I'll explain more about what that means later. And here's why I think free culture is important. You might ask, does art need the same freedoms as software? And I would ask you, have you ever adapted code or art? As a child, you might have played out a new story for Peter Pan with your friends, or you might have drawn fan art of Winnie the Pooh, or you might have, as an adult or a teenager, played a tabletop role playing game and used a character or a setting from a free culture story. Free culture protects and encourages this kind of interaction with art. It turns us from passive consumers into active participants with art. Free culture has lots of benefits. It allows us to fix works if there are problematic elements, like there might be technical mistakes in the work, or if I want to share a work with children, it would allow me the freedom to take out objectionable content like curse words. It allows translations into other languages to be done. I'll talk more about how this applies to comic books later. And it allows crossovers with other stories that I think would be interesting. It also lets people make fan art and charge money for it so that they can use their creativity and profit from it. Free culture, just like free software, guarantees the right to sell verbatim copies or to sell adapted copies of something. It makes expert review or bug reports easier if you combine it with a version control system like Git. And it encourages people to copy works so that they're more likely to last a long time because they exist in many places. Basically, it lets fans of a work, whether it's a drawing or a movie or a short story, to become collaborators instead of passive consumers. And it also benefits educators because they don't need to worry about what is or isn't fair use. They can easily incorporate content into their curricula. There are drawbacks to the opposite of free culture, non free culture. Non-free works don't allow us to expand them or exercise our creativity. We have to go through gatekeepers to be able to do that. They don't allow fixes to problematic elements. If I wanted to share a copy of a story that had the curse words removed online, I couldn't do that without the copyright holder's permission. They don't allow interesting crossovers. If I wanted to make a story that took two superheroes from the main superhero franchises and mix them together, I would not be allowed to do that. And they're often tied to merchandising. Non-free works often exist to sell plush and t-shirts, and they're not optimized for long-term persistence. For example, a streaming platform exclusive won't be around if the streaming platform ever goes down, or digital restrictions management might make a copy of the work useless in the long term. Another thing that's important that I think will resonate with all of you is that free culture lets us teach people about freedom in general, and the same concepts that apply to freely designed hardware or free software or free culture are the same across all of them. And I think it's easier to explain things with stories than with software to average people. Average people will understand what it means to be allowed to write a new Winnie the Pooh book because Winnie the Pooh is in the public domain, but they won't necessarily understand how to modify code because that's a more niche and nerdy thing. As I go through my slides, you'll notice art on the right. It's art that my wife has drawn and released under free culture licenses. Now I'll talk about the tools that I use for my specific type of free culture, which is writing stories. I like to use plain text formats like Markdown or Shanty or Gemtext because plain text formats are easily portable and plain text formats work on virtually all computers, and you can use a lot of tools that exist for coding to edit stories as well. I like to use Nano on GNU Linux or Gedit from the GNOME project. And on Android, I like to use Editor by Bill Farmer. It's available on F-Droid. One of the cool things if you're using plain text formats is you can use linters like MDL for markdown linting or proselint, which finds mistakes in writing. For example, it will warn you if you use the word very, which is a bad word and does not add anything to your writing that's good. I can also use version control easily with plain text formats. So I can put stuff up on my Git server and have it be easy for collaboration with other people. And I also like to just use paper notebooks. I actually write my notes in Markdown in paper notebooks because lightweight markup languages like Markdown work just as well on paper as they do on computers. My process for writing is I'll write in a notebook with Markdown formatting the first rough draft of the story. Sometimes I'll start typing on a computer. After that, if it was on paper, I'll transcribe it into a computer, and at this stage, I'm fixing basic mistakes like typographical errors or lexical illusions, but I'm not going to be focused on fixing story flaws. And then I'll revise it until I think is good enough to commit to my Git forge, and I consider this my alpha or beta version of the story. And then after that, I'll revise it more until it's good enough to send to my editor, and I'll use commit messages to keep track of changes I've made to the story, like if I rename a character or remove a scene. And then after my editor gives me feedback, I'll revise again until he and I are both happy with the story, and then I'll publish it. I'll talk about where I publish it later. I have a similar process for comic books, but this process also involves my wife. You can see on the right side is an example of line art, and I'll explain what that is in a minute. So we like to use a consistent file naming format so that scripting is easier later. It's title followed by page number, followed by a step, followed by an extension. Page numbers should be 2 digits unless you're doing a long comic. And then step codes that we use are step 0 is raw, which is penciling. Penciling looks kind of like this. It's where you just draw something with a rough pencil sketch and you can refine it later. We scan those in and then crop them and put a border around them. And then the line art is like what you see on the right side. It's what we do to make it look kind of like a coloring book. It's just black lines that are the basic outlines with nothing else. Then we'll color. In our process, coloring is including shading and lighting and flat colors and more detailed coloring. We put that all in one step, and we're saving discrete deliverables as we go. Then after my wife has done all the illustrations, I'll do the lettering, which I use Inkscape for with SVGs. We often use Speech Bubbles by David Revoy. And after the lettering, we'll export it as a final image. There's something important between the coloring and the lettering step. Why we have them separated as discrete deliverables is so that if we want to translate the story later or even make a different story that uses the same pictures but different text, we can, because it's a lot easier to add new speech bubbles than it is to try to edit existing speech bubbles. And we use, obviously, for the extension, it's a valid file extension. We use KRA Krita files, SVG Inkscape files, and we output to PNG. Each step code has its own directory in the project so that we can keep track of the files easily. On this page on the right, you can see what a colored page looks like. In this particular comic, this page was supposed to be grayscale to indicate a sad scene. And when I'm writing stories, I like to think my prose is code. So for novels or short stories, the source code is the text of the story, whether it's a plain text format like Markdown or whether it's a document like Open Document format. It's very straightforward to see what the source code is. For comics, source is a little bit harder to define. It's at least images with no captions like what you see here, but it's preferably SVG or KRA files of the art so that you can modify the art later if you need to. And on the right now you can see what that same frame looks like with speech bubbles. To generate ebook files like PDFs or EPUBs, I use Pandoc, which is like a Swiss Army knife for converting from one markup language to an output in another language. And I also use ImageMagick to generate images, especially when I'm making 2-page spreads for print. For example, I would need to figure out how to make pages like this, and it's just easier to do with a script and ImageMagick. And then I stitch all those PNGs together with image to PDF. When you're publishing ebooks, it's important to think about what format you're using. I prefer Shanty, which is from Nicholas Bernhard at Nantucket eBooks. It's like Markdown, but it has a lot of metadata for things like title or copyright information so that it can automatically generate an ebook. And after he runs it through his conversion process, it creates an HTML version of an ebook. There's another format called AMB, which stands for Ancient Machine Book. It's designed to run on really old systems and works on FreeDOS. The PDF is a common format for people to use for comic books and ebooks. One of the major downsides is that as a reader, I can't choose the font and font size that I need, so it's not always accessible. Deja Vu is like PDF. It's often used for scanned copies of documents. And EPUB is the standard ebook format that does support resizable text. GemPub is new. It uses GemText, which you would know about if you've heard about the Gemini protocol. It's like a lightweight alternative to the web. And then, of course, you can publish in HTML like Project Gutenberg does. There's a useful Wikipedia article called Comparison of Ebook Formats. And all these formats that I show on this page are free. We also have to think about proprietary formats when we're publishing. Pros of proprietary formats are they prevent e-waste by supporting existing devices, and they make ebooks easier to read for more people because they're discoverable on mainstream platforms. But there are a lot of cons to proprietary formats. They keep people from realizing that proprietary formats are bad. If I'm supporting proprietary formats, it makes it look like I think the formats are good. It also incentivizes people to develop for proprietary formats, and we don't want developers wasting their time supporting formats that don't respect the readers. They also increase overhead for authors and publishers because the authors and publishers have to support more formats than they would otherwise, and they make it less attractive for readers to boycott proprietary devices because why boycott a device if all the books I want to read are easily available for it? So a possible compromise would be to only publish in a proprietary format if, number one, the target device is discontinued. This addresses the concern about e-waste. Number two, the target device cannot open a free format. This condition prevents unnecessary compromises. And number three, there's no free software replacement that exists for the device's operating system or the ebook reader. If there is a free software replacement, then there's no point in supporting a non-free format. And never use DRM, digital restrictions management. It's unfair to the reader that they aren't allowed to read an ebook on whatever device they want to. And if a format or device requires DRM, it's not worth supporting. A similar concern is sustainable formats, and by sustainable, I mean being able to keep doing an activity for a long time, even with infrastructure disruptions or collapses. So sustainable formats are simple to implement clients for. AMB is an example. The specification is really small. Gem Pub is also a very simple sustainable format. They use few system resources, and they run well on old computers. By old, I'm meaning 20 years old or older. We should try to support old computers as long as possible to make sure we're being environmentally responsible. When we're publishing, free culture works, but especially free ebooks, metadata is important. Metadata about the licenses and authors is necessary for people to be able to exercise their freedoms. If I don't know something is under a free license, I won't know that I'm allowed to share it or modify it or make copies of it. And metadata about assets that you use to create work are also necessary as a show of respect and also to comply with licensing agreements for those assets. Like if I used images inside of one of my ebooks or if I used a font under the open font license. And source code, like the text of stories, should follow the reuse specification, which is from the Free Software Foundation in Europe. It's a way of adding a few lines to the beginning of a document or to a supporting metadata file that is a plain text file for things like PNGs that says who the author is and what license and what copyright year something has. Other metadata that's important is content ratings. Content ratings help people know whether or not they'll enjoy a story. If I have to get 3/4 of a way through a story to find out that there's objectionable content and I wouldn't have read the story otherwise, that can be disappointing and frustrating. So ideally, you should warn people about things up front so that they don't have to go through that experience. The developer's age rating system and open age rating service are both free software for age rating things, but they only apply to software like video games, so they would need to be adapted if we wanted to use them for ebooks. And Nantucket eBooks has a simple age rating system. It's just based on saying whether something is all ages or 13 plus or things like that. It doesn't specify specific content. When I'm publishing ebooks, I wanted to give you ideas for where to publish in freedom respecting places. Nantucket eBooks is great. I've worked with Nicholas Bernhard at Nantucket eBooks to publish my novel, The Woe Thief. We even worked together to make a paper copy of the book, which is comb bound. And if you write in Shanty, it's easy to get a nice looking ebook that shows up on a web page, and you can even archive the web page and read it offline. It's using fully free software, and my book, The Woe Thief, is also fully free culture. You can use an OPDS server, which is what the Calibre ebook software uses. Calibre is like the de facto standard for managing large ebook libraries, and OPDS servers are basically a way of publishing an ebook collection online. You could use normal online file distribution like HTTP or FTP, or you can use the sneakernet and put copies of a book on USB drives or SD cards or floppy disks or compact flash, whatever format you like to use. You can publish your web comics on Rarebit, which I talked to the developer of Rarebit, and afterward it was released in a free software license. So it's a good way to publish indie webcomics. And you can also do print publishing, like I mentioned earlier. These are both examples of one, a comic book that we've done, and one, a novel that we've done that are printed in small quantities. Whenever you're choosing where to publish, make sure that the platform respects freedom and works without non-free JavaScript. And if you can, self-host copies of your ebooks and possibly mirror other free culture ebooks that are similar to your own so that people can discover them. If I publish a free software fantasy novel, then it could be helpful to share copies of other free software or free culture fantasy novels so that people can easily find them. When you're making print, share handmade books with your friends, or you can use library boxes like Little Free Library. I have a few of those in my town. And you can use various formats. You can use saddle stitch as an easy DIY method for making a book. It works well for comic books or zines where you basically just sew the book together after poking holes in it with an awl. You can use staple binding, which just uses a stapler. You can use 3-ring binders or folders with the folding metal tabs if you don't have time to do binding. And the great thing about the print books is that readers don't need any non-free software to use them, and you can easily transport them over the sneakernet or the postal service. When we're writing free culture fiction, we can also use the fiction itself to explore themes about freedom in a way to educate people. Ada and Zangaman is a good example of a book that's doing that. Fantasy and science fiction are good at exploring themes that free software advocates care about, and free culture can empower us to make stories about freedom to build a community mythology so that we don't have to reference non free stories. We can talk to each other about stories that we've read that are written by and for our community. And the only limits are your imagination, not barriers like DRM or getting permission from a copyright holder. You can share and modify as long as you're complying with the license terms. So, for example, we could talk about a group of people. They're part robot and part plant. We'll call them herb droids. Their master created them as a way of having an army, and they were designed with software and firmware and operating systems so that they would do whatever he wants and be as aggressive as he wants them to be. And some of them found this system to be unjust and didn't want to wage wars for him, so he banished them to a metal poor planet. And without easy access to metal, they had to learn how to repair their own bodies to be able to survive. But over time, they figured out how to replace parts when they broke using different materials like wood, and they also learned how to change their programming and reverse engineer themselves so that they weren't vulnerable to the unbridled aggression that they were designed for. And this kind of idea we could use in a video game or as a mascot for a free software project or as part of a tabletop role playing game. So, as examples of what you could use this type of fantasy creature for, on the right, there is a drawing that my wife made that we used as a comic book as a gift for my nieces. And on the left are stats for a tabletop role playing game called Cairn, which is under a free culture license. So people who wanted to play with that kind of creature in their Cairn game could. And I submitted this creature to Yochai Gall, the author of Cairn, and he's going to incorporate it into a future version. I also have published a free culture fantasy novel that I mentioned called The Woe Thief. My wife illustrated the inside of it, and uh, I think it went really well. Nicholas Bernhard from Nantucket eBooks, he edited it, and overall, I think it's a wonderful project. I published it on Nantucket eBooks. I'm hoping to publish it in other places soon, and I'm hoping that other people will be able to build on top of this world that I've created. I have a wiki documenting creatures in it and characters, and I have a lot of other ideas and partial stories that are up on my Codeberg repository so that people can modify those if they want to. And this is the part where I give you a call to action. You too can release stuff under a free culture license. If you've written any fiction that you have just laying around, like maybe you've written something for a tabletop role playing game, or maybe it's something you wrote in high school that you were proud of at the time, you might be able to dust it off and publish it for others to adapt and build on your work. If you aren't an author yourself, you can catalog free characters on the public domain Superheroes Wiki or the open source Superheroes Wiki. Those both exist to help people find free culture characters that they can use in their stories or video games. I don't think the JavaScript on those websites is free though. And you might have some concerns about free culture, like, will someone get famous by copying me? Maybe they might get famous, but you can use a copyleft license that requires attribution so that if they make a copy of your work or an adaptation, they have to list you as the original author. You might wonder, how will I make money? It can be hard to make money on free things. Like in the free software movement, we're having trouble doing that as well. But the great thing about free software and free culture is, as the author, I'm allowed to sell copies of my work. Other people are allowed to sell copies of my work too. And we can build a community of trust where if I make an adaptation or copy and I'm selling it, then I can pass some of that money along to the original author. You might also have the concern of, what if someone uses my character for something that I dislike? Then that is a real concern. But there's also a real concern of the commons being small, and since public domain works aren't released very often, then that we have a risk of a culture drought. So it depends on whether you think a culture drought is more of a concern or somebody potentially using your character for something you disagree with. And here's what we need as a free culture community. We need something like a package manager for free culture works. Calibre partially provides this. I see this as working where I type a package install Peter Pan and it finds a copy of Peter Pan in my preferred format, for example, EPUB, and it downloads it from standard ebooks for me and keeps it in a consistent file structure and keeps track of where the books came from so that it's really easy to find free culture stuff. Better tooling for Shanty editing would be nice. If you want to add syntax highlighting for Shanty to your favorite text editor, that would be great. Directories of fiction in specific genres would be helpful for people to be able to find free culture works. And the directories wouldn't have to only list free culture works. The directories or lists would just need to be free culture themselves. Provenance tracking for media. I've often downloaded a song or a, an ebook and then forgotten who wrote it or where it came from. So having a system for keeping track of that would be helpful to make sure that we're able to keep reusing content. The reuse tool from the Free Software Foundation Europe might be able to help with this. Search engine filters or a search engine that only gives results for free culture works would be useful. uBlacklist is a browser extension that might be able to help with this. It would be kind of limited because it only blocks certain sources. It can't search for just free things. You would have to block an entire domain. And something like a Project Gutenberg for non-public domain free culture works would be good too. Currently, if you write a story under Creative Commons Attribution Share Alike, there's not a central place to share that story. And my focus here is asking people to help with discoverability of free culture works. So if you want to find examples of free culture fiction, Blender Open Movies, those are under free culture licenses. Project Gutenberg and Standard eBooks both share public domain ebooks, and Standard eBooks gives like really high quality books by typography nerds who care a lot about small details, and they're really nice, beautiful books. And related projects to this are Ada and Zangaman. It's a children's book about free software and ice cream and hacking. Cairn is a tabletop role-playing game under a free culture license with a really supportive community. A lot of them are on Mastodon. Uh, Wonoval Universe is what I call my story world, and you can see at my repository examples of characters and stories. Some are complete, some are drafts, some are outlines. Public domain superhero wiki and open source superhero wiki both list characters that you could use freely in your stories. And Jenny Everywhere is a character released under a free culture license, and other artists reinterpret her and draw her, which my wife has done before. And at this point, I'm ready for questions and answers.
We have a serial asker here that is Blender Dumbbass. I can ask the first question then. Does Shanty as metadata for licenses?
Yes, you can read on nantucketeebooks.com. There's a link to the Shanty documentation, and there is a way to specify which license it uses.
Okay, great. Question about proprietary formats and platforms. Could it be good to publish something in a proprietary way, but give a statement that this is an inferior version somewhere on the page one?
Yes, you could do that if you wanted to. Like, for example, on Kindle ebook readers, they can technically read PDFs or plain text, but it's not going to work as well as a Mobi format. So if you wanted to publish in a Mobi file format, which is what Kindle uses, you could put a disclaimer like, this isn't a standard well supported ebook format, you should move to something that uses a better one.
Okay, thanks. About rating systems, wouldn't it be better to avoid ageism, to have a rating system that just lists potentially disturbing stuff instead of giving an age number?
Yes, I think that kind of system is better, and that's actually what open age rating system does. It doesn't actually assign a number. It just says like this story contains alcohol or this story contains violence or things like that.
Do you know such platforms that do that?
I know of software platforms like GNOME software
Mm.
lists those sorts of reviews, but I don't know of anything that incorporates something like that for ebooks. Besides, Nantucket ebooks just has like an age number assigned to ebooks.
Okay, thanks. Last question for Blender Dumbas. Do you know any publishing house or company that is open to the idea of free culture books?
I think maybe O'Reilly is, but they publish textbooks, not fiction, so they're not like a good fit for me.
Okay, thank you. Do we have other questions? I don't see anything, so I think we can call it a talk. Thank you very much, Seth, for this very interesting talk. And people, you can i- indeed ask question on the IRC and other media that Seth has probably on a slide. I don't know.
Yeah,
To have more answers.
I'm Nyla Wothief at writing.exchange on Mastodon. If you go to my repository, that's the best way to get in touch with me. The link is right here. And you can also email me, nylawotheef at disroot.org. My email and username are based on the main character of my stories.
Thank you very much. So thank you. I think it's the end of the talks for today, and there is still other things in the program. Yeah, the keynotes of the FSF and the awards ceremony in the Jupiter room. So have a nice day, people, and see you later. Perhaps tomorrow. Bye.